The ACLU is putting the Ten Commandments on trial in Virginia and other places around the country. We'll talk about it today on Faith and Freedom. I'm Matt Staver, founder and chairman of Liberty Counsel. Joining me is Sean Akers, the vice president of Middle Eastern Affairs for Liberty Counsel. Sean, yesterday we talked about the Ten Commandments being on trial in Giles County. I want to pick up with somewhere where we left off and add a couple of different nuances to this. You know, the Ten Commandments were probably one of the most significant influences on American law and government. Most people don't realize how widespread and significant they are, not just on America, but on Western legal tradition, on the whole Western culture. Before you even get to the idea of the commandments itself, you know, when it starts off with there is a God and there is a singular God, there's monotheism. Most people don't recognize how significant of a development that is in world history. That comes from the Hebrews, where God is the sole God and you should have no other gods before him, which is reflected within the Ten Commandments. Sir Isaac Newton, if you go back and look at him and his discoveries, he comes from a Christian worldview. And Sir Isaac Newton actually states that he was able to discover things because he could trust the fact that there is creation and there is order to this creation, and there is God who created it. There is a singular monotheistic God who is a creator God. And consequently, if that's true, which that is true, and he's relying upon that, then he can discover things, that there is order in this creation. And therefore, as complicated and as ununderstandable as it may be at a particular point in a human's mind, you can continue to push through and you can continue to discover, because just like there's order in anything else that's created, there is order because it goes back to a monotheistic God. That could never have been done. The inventions that he did and others could never have been achieved under a polytheistic system. The reason is because it's like saying 2 + 2 = 4 as a basis of mathematics, but this other God says it could be 2 + 2 = 5, and another God, because of lust or power, could say, well, in my universe, 2 + 2 = 6. So there is no way for a human to be able to discover that kind of arbitrary system. Monotheism changed all of that radically.
Matt, that is absolutely fascinating. I had never thought about it in those terms, but if you do, logically, where you have Newton starting with the basic premise that if we don't know anything else, we know that there is a God and that he created in a manner that brings order to everything. The competitor for that, we know it was made famous by Nietzsche. It was said by more than him, but it was made famous by him as I think, therefore I am. In other words, it all starts with the human mind, that the one basic premise is that there is man and that man creates whatever man decides to create. So if you look at it in those terms, this battle's not just over a picture that would hang on the wall. It's literally for the hearts and minds of our children, whether they come up in a society that says there is a God and there is order and you can discover it. You can discover the laws of nature and nature's God and bring about a life that is fruitful and that is moral and that works, or there's only relativity. There's only what man decides. So it's all about nothing but the exercise of power.
That's right. And therefore, when you move to law and policy, because philosophers, theologians, they all intersected law and policy. We've dissected them and we've divorced them today as though they're two different universes. Right. But for the original early thinkers, they all came out of the same thing. So there's a lot of theology behind law. There's a lot of law behind theology. So what you ultimately find is that monotheism brings order out of chaos. And therefore, not only can you discover things, but there's certain rules or principles that are higher principles. We think of them as maybe the law of gravity would be a higher principle that we are governed by that was discovered. Right. And ultimately, there's other laws as well. There's laws that govern us as individuals. So our earthly laws must reflect those higher principles and not be in conflict with them. Thus, you come to Blackstone, where Blackstone ultimately has the idea that there's the law of nature and of nature's God, and these manifestations of law must be consistent with the higher law. And if they're not, then there's no law at all, because you cannot have an earthly law that contradicts or conflicts with a higher law. And so that all this idea of the rule of law, even the king being under the rule of law, that comes out of the Magna Carta, all of those things are inextricably connected to the Hebrews' monotheism reflected in the Ten Commandments. And then because there is a unitary God and you should have no other allegiance to another God besides God Almighty, then you should, therefore, love your parents, obey your parents. You should not commit adultery. You should have these certain kinds of ethical dealings among one another. You should not murder another human being, and so forth.
You know, Matt, it's amazing that the far left understands just how quintessential that is, that philosophical foundation to the way that children in the United States will come to interact, will come to create and support policy and government and law. Everything changes if you pull out not just, I mean, the way that you've put it this morning, it's absolutely fascinating that while the Ten Commandments are incredibly important, if you take out even the first, if you take out just the reference to the acknowledgement that there is a God who brings order, then everything else lacks foundation.
That's right. I mean, there's no reason to not take another person's life. There is this higher law, and there's this order that flows from monotheism or God. And therefore, as a result, this is how you ought to deal with one another as human beings. And this ultimately develops the idea of equality, that we're all created equal. Mm-hmm. You ultimately see that manifested in the Declaration of Independence, that we are created. And by virtue of that creation, God has created us equal. And he's infused in us, by virtue of the fact that he created us, certain unalienable rights that government can't take away, we must protect, and that is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, in Giles County, of course, the ACLU wants to take the Ten Commandments as part of this foundation display off the wall. Let me just kind of go through some of these real quickly.
Sure.
That's on the wall. It's the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the Mayflower Compact, the Ten Commandments, the Bill of Rights. There's a Statue of Religious Freedom drafted by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Rights in Virginia drafted by George Mason. That was the precursor to the Declaration. We have a depiction, we have the first Charter of Virginia, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which is the oldest constitution in American history going back to the colonial time. Depiction of Patrick Henry with the depiction of a Minuteman, a depiction of George Washington, Washington's farewell address, Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist, his letter to Reverend Samuel Miller, his 1779 Thanksgiving Proclamation, the Northwest Ordinance, and a document explaining all of these, plus a resolution that says individuals who want to put up more historical documents may do so. So they can actually bring additional historical documents. All of these, interestingly, are tied to the standards of learning in Virginia. Amazingly, on page 74, and it's in many textbooks that are being taught currently in Virginia schools, one of which was studied by this particular student who is bringing the lawsuit. It's the American Government display. And on page 74, American Government textbook, on page 74, and these are written by Prentice Hall, McGraw-Hill. These are not right-wing Christian publishers. On page 74, the American Government display, it has Roots of Democracy. What does it begin with? The Ten Commandments. And then it goes all the way down through Enlightenment, Greco-Roman, other influences on our law. But the roots of democracy in this textbook begin with the Ten Commandments.
So, Matt, how do we respond to this onslaught that's picked out just one of the basis for our law and government?
Well, what's amazing is that the Doe 2, the parent, in the deposition ultimately agreed with the statements in the textbooks. Understands that the Ten Commandments had this influence, but they shouldn't be posted on a wall. I mean, the craziness of this is, I think, absurd. The interesting thing is that since 2005, we've won most of the Ten Commandments cases in the country. We just have to keep moving forward, bringing logical and historical arguments to the court, and ultimately, we don't know which way the court's going to go in this case, but I can tell you this is not the last case on the Ten Commandments.
No, in the Liberty Counsel, it does not stop. You will keep fighting these and keep representing the people of the United States to ensure that we don't lose this incredible piece of our history.
Well, we've got a great little booklet. It's called The 10 Commandments in American Law and Government, and it goes over the 10 Commandments in American Law and Government. That's a very fascinating read. You'll read court cases and other historical documents that reference the 10 Commandments. You can order the booklet at lc.org.